So welcome to this webinar to relaunch the journal, Justice, Power and Resistance. And we're delighted to now be publishing the journal with Policy Press in association with the European Group for the Study of Deviance and Social Control, who published the journal up until now. And we're now working very closely with the group and we're very grateful to them. We'll be recording the webinar so that we can make it available for people afterwards. So just to let you know that. And we relaunch with an absolutely brilliant and highly topical issue on pandemics, policing and protest, with a really excellent lineup of international authors. And we're very lucky to have some of them joining us today, along with coordinators from the European Group and members of the Editorial Collective. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to our first speaker on behalf of the European Group, and that's Katja Simonsik. Thank you, Katja.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, so yes, as Julia said, I'm currently one of the three coordinators of the European Group, alongside the brilliant Vicki Canning, who is also here, and Dani Jimenez. So I'm going to try to be brief and just say a few words about the EG, but Julia, please interrupt me when my time is up. So yeah, the EG, it was founded in Florence in Italy in 1973, and it's an international network for academics, practitioners and activists working towards social justice, state accountability and decarceration. And it's an open forum promoting critical analysis, connecting theory, politics and activism. And when it was founded, Stan Cohn, according to David Scott, said that the EG is a group with a strong anarchistic and libertarian ethos. So as time has passed, the philosophies of Marxism, phenomenology, penal abolitionism, feminism, anti-racism, insights of Foucault and others also became influential in the group. And what unites all these potentially contradictory philosophies are their critique of hierarchies of power and the call for progressive and emancipatory change rooted in alternative critical normative values. So the EG has also an explicit intention of not just understanding individual and social problems, but also challenging and transforming power relations. And today it has over 1,000 members who are spread across 6 different continents, which makes the group the largest critical criminology forum in the world. And it exists and persists thanks to the work of its members who contribute on a voluntary basis in many different ways. The work is split into working groups. So there are 6 working groups in existence, and people work together in line with their interests. So the first one deals with prisons, punishment and detention. The second one with policing and security. Then we have crimes of the powerful, social harm, fear and looting in the periphery, and historical, philosophical and artistic approaches on the study of deviance and social control. The highlight of our collaboration, if I can say it like that, happens every September with the annual conference. And every year, the group holds a conference in a European country and tries to link the conference theme to local and political social issues. And each conference brings together a broad range of people from across the world, students, activists, academics, practitioners, and the conferences are always diverse, unique, and really different from mainstream conferences. So we are non-hierarchical in line with the values of the EG. So it makes no difference if someone is a PhD student or a highly distinguished professor, since we are all students of deviancy and social control. And the conferences are deliberately informal, emphasizing mutual support, cooperation, solidarity, and friendship. And there is great respect for differences and tolerance of diversity. We always try to make sure that there's a discounted option for the unemployed, for students, to try to enable them to attend the conference. And content is always more important than form. So at an EG conference, one might see a distinguished professor in flip-flops, the debates are always engaging and long, and we always make sure that we have time to connect, discuss outside of the conference venue. And in my personal experience, I actually discovered the EG online randomly when I wanted to learn more about the concept of social harm. And at that time, the website was a bit dated, so I didn't really know what I was getting myself into when I booked a ticket to Portugal. But I was really warmly accepted the first year I came, not knowing anyone. And I was fascinated because I was able to discuss really important issues with people whose books I've been reading. And I was starstruck in a way, and so happy that I had access to such knowledge and experts in the field. And I have really nowhere else in my academic career encountered such warm, down-to-earth, genuine people. So it's a real privilege to be a part of the group. And the EG is not just an academic network, but it also involves activists fighting for social justice. And this was really evident in 2019 at our conference in Barcelona, which was held at Can Batlló, which is a self-organized Catalan center occupied by its neighbors that saved it and created a vibrant space. So we had closing and opening session run by activists who shared their knowledge, and by people working in the Catalonian streets and who suffered police harassment and so on. And so, yeah, we have conferences normally every year, but we haven't had one for 2 years due to COVID. And we're really excited to meet again this year in the fall in Torino. So, yeah, that's all from me.
Wonderful. Thank you, Katja. That's a great introduction to the European group. So I'm going to move on now to Ida, who's one of the co-editors of the journal, and she's going to talk to us about this special issue and about the journal in general. Thank you, Ida. Once you can unmute yourself. It's a classic of modern times, isn't it? There you go.
We have 2 screens here. We're trying to navigate them. Okay, so yeah, well, thank you for the introduction. So I'm going to present this particular issue and also the journal. So after a short break, now the Justice, Power and Resistance Journal is relaunching with this special issue, Pandemics, Policing and Protests. And this special issue is published against a background of ongoing crisis and control. The management of the pandemic crisis has evidenced the economic violence of capitalism, as an increasing number of people were forced into poverty, while the health risks and dangers associated with work and the workplace became heightened. Responses to the COVID crisis have increased and strengthened pre-existing social, political, and economic inequalities, particularly in relation to age, disability, sex, race, class, and their intersections. That's disproportionately impacted Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. This has made several scholars and activists to link the COVID crisis to the structural nature of racism and the role of the police in this. The police killings of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd in the US in 2020 sparked the Black Lives Matter movement and heightened calls for defunding and abolish the police, as well as for critical questioning of criminal justice processes more broadly. This relaunch issue hopes to raise questions about the use of the police during a health crisis, but also about the use of policing more broadly as a response to problems and demands. So this issue features a range of responses to questions about pandemics, policing, and protests. Paul Bett's article critically discusses evidence-based policing, an approach which has become institutionalized within policing, but also within the academy in the UK and elsewhere. A different form of engagement with policing can be found in Greg Martin's work exploring the criminalization of everyday life and the policing of protests during the COVID-19 pandemic, primarily in the Australian context. The mystification of state practices and their failure to secure safety for all is further explored in Sam Hank's discussions about the policing of sex work. And the subjection of the most marginalized to further forms of violence is a theme which also features in Imogen Richards' article, which argues that neoliberal governments across the world have sought to hold their citizens responsible for governmental failings during the pandemics. Emma Ryan, Ian Warren, and Bree Calton documented theoretical relationships between biopolitics, control, and the broad idea of pandemic policing. Exploring the responses to the pandemic in Italy, Vincenzo Scalia traces their roots in the hyper-neoliberalism of the right and a repressive attitude of a centrist Italian left, developed since the 1970s. This issue also features highly topical articles by Joe Sim and Steve Toms, by Thalia Anthony and Vicki Shartrand, and by David White, which they themselves will present in just a minute. The issue furthermore provides a book review by Elin Bengtsson of 2019's Justice Alternatives, edited by Pat Collin and Leandro Aires-Franca. And in addition to journal articles and book reviews, importantly, the journal features an intervention section, which includes campaign updates, reflections, biographical accounts, and social movement contributions. In this issue's intervention, Karl Nafstad from the Norwegian organization Normal connects the Black Lives Matter movement and police abolitionism to the ongoing political debates around drug policy reform in Norway. So before ending, I also wanted to say a couple of words about coming issues, so you know what you can expect in the coming years. So we actually have several special issues on its way in the coming years. We have one coming on social harms in algorithmic context, one on Southern criminology, and we have a special issue on state harm and violence. And also there will be a special issue on Thomas Mathisen and Thomas Mathisen's legacy. While this does not mean that we do not have room for individual contribution and individual articles with all these special issues coming, individual contributions are highly welcome, and if submitted articles coincide with publications of special issues, we will always publish them online first, so to avoid any delays of publication. So in general, we can say that we welcome theoretical and ethnographic studies from interdisciplinary perspectives, including fields such as sociology, semiology, geography, law, history, criminology, penology, philosophy, social policy, and social theory, from scholars and from activists. The journal is primarily a vehicle to make accessible and advanced challenging research and scholarship that can be utilized to critically inform contemporary debates and policies. Thank you. That was all from me.
Wonderful. That's a great introduction. Thank you very much, Ida. So now we're going to have one of the first set of authors talking about the paper in the first issue, and that is Joe Sim and Steve Tombs talking about narrating the coronavirus crisis, state talk and state silence in the UK. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation to speak today. My internet connection is a bit unstable, so please, if I disappear into cyberspace, then please excuse me. I'm going to talk, it's me and Steve's paper, I'm going to talk about it today, and then Steve will be there for the questions and answer sessions. Our article focuses on the first year of the pandemic in the UK, and we want to talk today about state talk, the fact that the state never stopped talking in that first year. And they were supported, the state was supported by medical experts in socially constructing a dominant narrative and a state truth, in inverted commas, of course, about the virus in general and about deaths in particular, and how that was generated is the focus of our paper. We also wanted to just mention the question of responsibility. By 2021, the UK's death rate was the third highest in the world. And in this early period, the state was relentless in shifting responsibility onto those breaking the lockdown rules, except Partygate, as it turned out, and away from the often lamentable death-inducing decisions made by government ministers and their advisors. So state, government, medical talk, the narrative, their truth was built on repression and control, changing reporting and recording practices, hyperbole, half-truths, lies, and suppressing international comparisons. How did they do it? How did they do it? Well, between March 2020 and January 2021, there were 233 UK government press briefings, addresses by the Prime Minister to the nation, NHS data briefings, and COVID-19 task force briefings. These briefings were part of the the government's public relations strategy, which was run like a political campaign. It was held in the wood-panelled press room of 10 Downing Street. Each briefing consisted of Boris Johnson, our senior government minister, at centre stage, immediately, of course, between two Union Jack flags, in case we missed the message there. And to the left and right, suitably distant, were two experts, in inverted commas, speaking on the theme of that day's address and reinforcing the government's message. And these were addresses because although questions were taken, these were heavily stage managed, with vetting of those journalists being admitted and pre-selection of their questions, which were rarely answered, frankly, because especially if they proved penetrating. Follow-up questions were rarely allowed. This meant that ministers and experts' answers were left unchallenged, again reinforcing the state's dominant narrative. These daily visual and oral performances were supplemented by a new coronavirus section in the government's website, and that contained 31 pages detailing the 455 parliamentary debates and announcements that occurred in the year between January 20 and January 21. On average, there was one such debate or announcement each day during this period. So state discourses were continuously reinforced by using a whole number of different languages and phrases. And we had things like charting the battle, hyperbolic use of numbers, and a wide variety of militaristic metaphors. There were false claims about the unprecedented nature of the virus, about lockdown, about personal protective equipment, about testing, about tracing. And that was put in the context of UK exceptionalism, world beating, which we hear in every aspect from Johnson's government today. Then at the start of 2021, there was a shift in state talk. That started to be built around living with the virus, get back to normal, when of course it was the old capitalist normal that had generated the conditions for the genesis and the spread of the virus in the first place. And central to this discourse was responsibilizing and individualizing death. From early 2021, the government was remorselessly concerned with identifying and punishing those who were failing to comply with the lockdown rules, except themselves. Individualising responsibility became central to every government pronouncement. But the wider reasons, the wider questions why individuals did not comply were largely silenced. These reasons included the fact that 23% of the UK population was now living in poverty, that at £95.85 a week, the UK had one of the lowest rates of statutory sick pay in the allegedly developed world, and that 2 million people who earned less than £120 a week earned too little to be eligible for benefits. So Stephen Reichers pointed out that 20 million people were required to go to work due to the lack of support for people to self-isolate and to stay at home. So shifting the focus from structural deprivations to individuals' non-compliance was crucial in moving political and popular attention onto the alleged atavistic feelings of individuals and their families, marooned in communities stuck on the bottom rung of the ladder of gross and reprehensible inequality. And while the government focused on regulating the rule breakers, it was failing to regulate and police businesses and corporations who were pressurising employees to return to work too soon after a positive test, or who were breaking COVID rules. The largest known COVID outbreak at a workplace actually happened in a government agency, DVLA. Workers were reportedly told to turn off their test and trace app to avoid being notified if they had come into contact with a positive case. Employees with symptoms were encouraged to go in, and vulnerable workers had the request to work from home turned down. It was a class-based criminalisation strategy of enforcement which impacted on poor, BME people, etc., disproportionately. In April 2021, over 85,000 fixed penalty notices had been issued against individuals who had allegedly broken the rules, COVID-19 laws. In contrast, by the end of 2020, not one company had been prosecuted for failing to maintain COVID-19 secure workplaces. And the individualisation of responsibility was reinforced by the government's relentless focus on the vaccination programme. Britain was world beating yet again. Its rollout was central as a central focus in government briefings from the beginning of 2021. In contrast, at the beginning of that year, there was silence around the deaths. In January 20th, 1,820 people died in the UK, one person every minute over the previous 24 hours, the highest number since the pandemic began. A paramedic described the number of deaths as now equating to more than a jumbo jet of people crashing in the country every day. And yet, it's all well, what does it matter? Having said all of that, this is the final couple of points myself and Steve want to make today. There's always a nerve of resistance and outrage at these things, as E.P. Thompson said many years ago. The government, despite the deep well of material and ideological resources at its disposal, has not managed to construct a dominant and domineering narrative. It's failed to achieve hegemony. As Stuart Hall has always said, history is never closed, but maintains an open horizon towards the future. So there's spaces for alternative truths here to emerge. For example, from the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group in the UK, from Independent Sage, and indeed from critical academics and lawyers as well, talking a different language, developing an alternative language, for example, around social harms, the public harms and the private harms around domestic violence that have happened, preventable deaths, social murder, democratic accountability, and of course, at the end of the day, doing these people for corporate manslaughter, and we would think would argue as well, perhaps murder. So today, this is the final point I want to make today. Looking at Johns Hopkins University data, there have been just under 180,000 deaths in the UK. The UK is now 11th in the world in terms of having the most deaths proportionately to their COVID-19 cases of populations. There have been 409 new deaths in the last week, 2,037 deaths in the past month, and there was 57 deaths yesterday. So in June 2022, there's a pulverizing silence, as Thomas Mathieson would have called it, around these deaths, and critically considering the politics of the silence is for another day. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Joe. That was brilliant. What a sobering account of what we've been through here in the UK, and you could almost forget that looking at the way it's being treated right now. So and so many important points raised too. So for the next speakers sadly couldn't be with us in person, but I'm going to play a video. This is Thalia Anthony and Vicki Shartrand, authors of States of Prison Abolition, COVID-19 and Anti-Colonial and Anti-Racist Organising. And bear with me while I make this all work. Thank you. Hopefully you can see that now.
I'm at Bishop's University and...
Sorry, I'm just going to start that again in case you couldn't hear the beginning of it. Here we go.
Well, good day or good evening, folks, depending on where you are in the world today. But I'm Vicki Shartrand and I'm at Bishop's University and also on the beautiful unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Abenaki people. And we also have...
Hi, I'm Thalia Anthony. I'm from the University of Technology, Sydney, and I am living and working on the sovereign lands of the Gadigal and Wongal peoples of the Eora Nation, just wanting to honour them and their continuing contribution to knowledges and laws that I have learnt so much from, and really happy to be here in conversation with Vicki to talk about our article States of Abolition, COVID-19 and Anti-Colonial and Anti-Racist Organising.
Yeah, well, Thalia had actually invited me to come in on this article with her. And so Thalia, 2 years post-pandemic, and where are we today?
Yeah, thanks, Vicki. It's really great to collaborate with you and just someone from another occupied colony, which continues to be a colony today, and to see the parallels in the forms of structural oppression. And I think where we are today and what's happened over the last 2.5 years since the COVID-19 pandemic has really put a spotlight on the types of injustices, especially for the incarcerated, because what we already knew as activists and as collaborators with people in prison is that prison has always been a very deadly place where there have been the proliferation of diseases, where there have been deaths in custody, especially for First Nations people. But with COVID-19, this took it to a whole new level where people who were confined in very small spaces, who were put in lockdown conditions with little fresh air and ventilation, were subject to not only the threat and the reality of the transmission of COVID-19, but the fear that their time in prison would be a death sentence. And that converged with the killing of George Floyd, with a number of deaths in custody. In Australia, the shooting of Kumanjai Walker just before the pandemic, and this, I think, reality that society was, in a sense, under siege generally, but the people who were feeling the gravest forms of oppression were First Nations and Black people. And while that was, I think, very much felt by the First Nations and Black communities, it was also a wake-up call for broader society to see that they were complicit in these systems of policing and prisons. And I think because of the questioning of government controls and COVID, people were starting to open their eyes to how these systems interacted in violent and fatal ways. And I think this then spawned movements in opposition that were directed towards not only the carceral systems, but other systems in Canada and Australia of colonial oppression.
Yeah, I feel the same way. It's interesting because on one hand we see how COVID-19 exacerbated the situation for, like, in the prisons, for example, where now we started to see people who are being locked down for 23 hours a day, which is tantamount to solitary confinement, which in Canada the courts had actually ruled as unconstitutional in terms of the Nelson Mandela rules, as cruel and unusual. And so here we had a legitimator or justifier of people being locked down for 23 hours without the proper sanitization equipments and the like, and being penalized when they were trying to find ways of protecting themselves. And also, in addition to that, being concerned for their loved ones on the outside, but not having any kind of contact with people. And so on one hand, we saw those, as you were talking about, all those exacerbations, but on the other hand, it was an opportunity that exposed some of those kinds of realities. And I think for the first time, with all the and I'm not trying to, relate the prison to life in isolation and pandemic, but people started to feel that kind of isolation. If you could feel the isolation from the pandemic, you'd start to have some kind of understanding of what it might be like in prison environment. So it really did, as you say, put the spotlight on the prisons. And that this is when we started to see a real gathering or a critical mass of people starting to organize around the prison and in support of this idea of decarceration, and why, questioning the whole viability of the 17th, 16th century institution to begin with. I mean, the prison's archaic.
That's right. And I think what this article does, and Vicki, you show really powerfully in Canada, but it also occurred in Australia, that this activism and these uprisings were not just on the outside. In many ways, they started inside prisons. And, in Canada, with the hunger strikes and other forms of activism, it brought awareness to these issues that helped the movement grow. And then in Australia, we had a number of actions where in Long Bay and Parklee prisons in Sydney, people got on rooftops, they got into prison yards, and they put up the message BLM, Black Lives Matter, to show their solidarity, but also to show that we're Black people, we're First Nations people, our lives matter, don't forget about us. And people responded. You know, people kind of came out on the streets. We had car convoys around Long Bay Prison. There was lots of media and solidarity work done to support these actions by prisoner groups such as Justice Action. So there was a lot of mobilization that was centered and arising from the lived experience of people in prison. And I think those ties of solidarity and you know, linking it in with not only a kind of political ideology, but the actual struggles of people inside meant that it had a very galvanizing effect on, you know, the hearts, minds, and effectively the actions of people in broader society.
Brilliant. I hope you could all hear and see that properly. That was a very illuminating description of Vicki and Thalia's paper, and I'm definitely really interested in going to read that paper now. So, along with all the others, of course, including David's. So, our final speaker from the authors of the relaunch issue is David White, and he's going to be speaking about regulating viral capitalism, 4 stages and a pathology of accumulation. Over to you. Thank you, David. Just a reminder first to put your questions in the chat. Sorry.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'll start by just saying something else. It's not about the paper, but colleagues of mine and me are currently on a marking boycott as part of a national dispute, but also mainly as part of a local dispute. So if people are wanting to support my colleagues, not me, I'm paid enough, I'm a well-paid professor, but a lot of people are going to be facing 100% deductions. If people want to make a donation, please go on to the Queen Mary University of London, UCU, Facebook or Twitter and make a donation. That's probably used up a good minute, which was the plan, really. My paper is really about how the pandemic was socially constructed. Now, I'm very aware that I remember having a student, I think I was at Stirling at the time, and I started talking about something, I can't remember what it was, as socially constructed, and he just stopped me and he says, "Oh, not another one." He says, "That's all we get here. Everything is socially constructed. Like everything from policing to prisons to, you know," and I think that's like, you know, we can be a little bit vague sometimes when we talk about a process of social construction, but the paper kind of starts off by saying, look, it's important to recognize that, because it also means that it could have been avoided, and certainly avoided in the ways that other people have been talking about. And I think we can also be a bit more specific. I think we can understand the pandemic, and particularly the processes the social processes that produce zoonotic pathogens and spread them and cure them, as always intimately related to a process of capital accumulation and a regulated regime of capital accumulation. So policing in the broadest sense, this issue is about policing, but policing processes in the broadest sense, that there are processes of regulation which reproduce all of the conditions that allow the emergence and the spread and the control, or the non-control, as we heard very clearly in terms of the UK government from Steve and Joe, of the social impacts, the health impacts, the deaths that have been caused. So I'm looking at the paper looks at 4 different moments, if you like, of the regime of accumulation. The moment of release, so where we have predatory practices of capitalist development, where there is zoonotic spillover, or the process by which particular diseases emerge from so-called wilderness areas and then become exposed to other animals and eventually to the human population. You can't understand that process without understanding deforestation, without understanding industrial development. Now, that's not to say all diseases that move from animals to humans are industrially produced, but the chances are immeasurably increased of that happening. And certainly we could talk about what the origins of this particular disease were, and I'll maybe, if I've got time, come back to that. But industrial development of land is the main cause. Secondly, amplification. How then, once there is zoonotic spillover, how that leap to humans becomes amplified. And so the paper talks about the process of upscaling of industrial farming, particularly animal farming. And again, if I've got time, I'll come back and give some examples of that. Third, the way it spreads. Now, we talked, we heard a lot about the way in which borders were controlled or should have been controlled, what happened in terms of international transport. Actually, the paper makes the argument that there are not very many ways to easily control the spread once it's in the human pool. Once a virus like this is in the human pool, but one place you can control it very easily, and one place where we saw it spreading, again, we've heard several examples of that, is in the workplace. And so the paper goes into looking at how sites of social concentration, particularly transportation domestically and workplaces, are crucial for enabling those viruses to spread, and are always connected to processes of value production through labor, always related to making sure that capitalism is not interrupted. And that was our experience. And again, if I have time, I keep saying if I have time, and I'll look up and another minute's gone, but I'll try and get back to maybe at least one example of each of these. Finally, fourthly, in medical intervention, I think we have to look at the commodification of testing and vaccination regimes, certainly as something which didn't allow us to control the spread. If we look at the developed world right now, only 1 in 11 people are fully vaccinated, compared to 1 in 2, 1 in 3, maybe more, depending how you count it in global north countries. So the medical intervention is also mediated through that regime of capital accumulation. And look, what the article tries to do is give examples of about how that is regulated, and not regulated in a sense that that things are always controlled. And actually, the chapter rather boringly starts with my contribution to a book chapter that I wrote with Stephen and Joe a number of years ago, the Introduction to State Power and Crime, where we talk about the failing of criminology's fixation with the state as policeman, right, rather than the infrastructural state, the productive state, or what Foucault distinguished between the right to seizure and the right to produce. So the right to a more productive power, that the state is always there. The state's productive capacity is always present. So those regimes are deliberately designed in order to accumulate, and those regimes are precisely the regimes that increase the chances of zoonotic spillover, zoonotic leap, and then the spread of viruses. If we look very briefly, I know I've only got probably a minute or two, but very briefly, if we look at how forest deforestation is regulated, for example, the first process I talked about, release, the predatory practices of capitalist development. Actually, there's only about 10 international agreements on forestry. None of them have anything approaching a regulatory system that's capable of enforcing anything. And so it's left up to local governments. And, many people here will know what's happened in the Amazon, what Bolsonaro's done to completely cripple any chance of a forest code in the Amazon being upheld in Brazil, and actively engaged in encouraging deforestation. But it's not just Bolsonaro. In 2020, the first year of the pandemic, that was the global rate of deforestation was the highest for a decade. And that is because of deliberate processes of state intervention and the way in which access to the forests are regulated and indeed policed. So that's one example of the kind of questions that, like, I hope the paper really asks, right? We don't just have to ask the questions and point the finger in terms of those kind of immediate responses, but we need to think about the much more enduring conditions that allow what I call pathological capital, pathological regimes of accumulation to emerge across those kind of 4 dimensions. And it's not really, I have to say, all I've done is assembled a few kind of empirical reference points. Really, there are other people who've done kind of much deeper and much longer project of work on this, including Mike Davis, including a number of Marxist biologists in the States. But I think these are lessons that we have to pay attention to, because we can't get away from the fact that not only was this virus created and produced, but it was made much worse because we were focused on the process of capital, of producing and reproducing capital, and making sure that a particular elite is in power. And it also explains why I think there are so many kind of uneven effects globally. And of course, Britain had one of the highest death rates, but Black people in Britain died at a much higher rate than white people. And that's all to do with the way in which social access to healthcare, to housing, and the kinds of work that people are forced to do play out. And so I think that's what I try and do. It sounds very kind of didactic and very kind of rudimentary 101 Marxism, but I do try and just get back to those processes of capital accumulation that are always linked to the chances of a virus emerging, and then the chances of it spreading, and the limited chances of us managing to control it.
Thank you, David. Yeah, definitely some really important points raised there too. And I think, safe to say, plenty more research will be going on, and we welcome further papers on all of these issues for the journal on behalf of the editors. So that's the end of the authors from the special issue that's just published on pandemics, policing and protest. And now we're going to have a couple of comments from members of the editorial collective on the first issue and on the journal in general, and general thoughts. And we're going to start off with Vico's. Thanks very much, Vico.
Thank you, Julia. And thank you all for inviting me, an African, to join the European group. That's an evidence that things are changing in Europe, because Europeans tended to be insular and to think that European problems are only for Europeans to think about, and the rest of us, we don't even do any thinking. So inviting an African to the editorial collective of the European group is really a progressive step on the part of our European comrades. But I want to dedicate my comments today to a pioneering person of African descent who led in the questioning for justice and for resistance against the powers that be. And that person has already been cited by Josim, and the person I'm talking about, is Theo Hall. His work is central to the concerns of JPA, and I was fortunate to have bumped into him during my research on Black women and the criminal justice system, and he set me straight theoretically by introducing me to the theory of articulation as applied to race, class, gender, and its implications for coalitions and alliance building in the struggle against authoritarian populism worldwide. I thank Josim, I thank Steve Toon, Pete Gill, and others at John Moores University, where I got my first job after the PhD, and they mentored me. Dave White was also there as a colleague, and many others. So I was really fortunate in that sense of working in a program where the majority of colleagues were critical thinkers. This is something that I benefited from. My 2 books were published. My first book was published while I was there, but my second book was actually done while I was at John Moores University. I'm very proud of that connection. So I would also like to acknowledge the influence of people like Paul Gilroy in helping to to form my own path to critical thinking in criminology, although he's not a criminologist. His paper on the myth of Black criminality in the Socialist Registrar of 1982 remains for me a favorite reading item on my list because of his challenge to left realism in criminology, which is something that we should always be aware of, that just because we are critical or on the left doesn't mean that we are above criticism, that we should always allow internal criticism to sharpen our resistance to the existing power structures. So looking at the current issue of the journal on the pandemic, I would like us to answer that question that has been posed anonymously to the authors of the relaunch issue. Are there other areas or regions that we are left out from consideration in the contents of the relaunch? And I would say Africa. How come Africa has fared a lot better than predicted? The wife of Bill Gates, Melinda, was saying that there will be dead bodies littering the streets of Africa because of the pandemic, because of our low health infrastructure, because of our funding deficiencies, in spite of our enormous wealth in natural resources. And that's something that we need as people who resist the capitalist accumulation that is tied to this pandemic. See, a lot of people are making a lot of money from the pandemic because the governments are buying all the vaccines and giving them out for free, which is what they should have done with healthcare all over the world. It shouldn't be commodified. We should all have access to healthcare as a matter of right, because the pandemic doesn't affect only poor Burmese people or people who come from African background, Asian or indigenous peoples. If you allow the pandemic to circulate, then the rich people will also pay a price for neglecting healthcare. That model of pooling resources to test anybody who wants to get tested, to give vaccines to everybody who needs it, to treat people who are ill is something that the pandemic might be teaching us. But beyond that, I would also encourage the European group to continue what you're doing by inviting somebody like me to be on the collective. I told colleagues earlier before we started that the poster behind me, that is the background to my Zoom, is from Tate Gallery in London. They had an exhibition of socialist posters, and I went to see, but there was no Black person in any of the posters, no Asian person either. These were just Euro-communist posters. So I decided to pose for a photograph. You can see my head down there with this poster, partly because these are my intellectual heroes, honestly speaking, but also partly to decolonize the concept of Marxism or socialism as a European idea, when Marx himself in Das Kapital cited Africans hundreds of times as his inspiration for writing the book. I did an article about that. Anybody interested, I can share that article. But looking at Europe today, Europe isn't white anymore or exclusively white. There are lots of colleagues in Europe who are making useful contributions, but we're not seeing them in the work of the European group as much as we would like to. So it might be a good idea for the European group to reach out, to commission more work, to do more focus on special issues, on some of those contributions that are not visible or enough for the students and colleagues to learn from. And having said that, I think my 5 minutes is over, right? It isn't. Okay, I still got a minute or two. I would like to commend the European group also for remaining activists in the work that we do. This is something that Josine, Pete Gill, Steve Toom, and others we are emphasizing at John Moores University, and I felt like fish in water, joining them in 1994 to further my own learning. The focus of individual members of the group can differ, but is it possible for the group to occasionally, like Dave was advocating earlier, to highlight one issue where we all pool our resources, intellectual and otherwise, to contribute to seeking solutions or supporting resistance in any part of the world? And I'm saying this because I know that we all value activism, but how do we teach activism in our classes, knowing that the vast majority of our students are probably for practical reasons going to aim for courses that will get them jobs? And activism is looked down upon as something that could get you fired from a job. But I say to my students and to my colleagues to look around and see what is happening with all the critical criminologists in the world. They all have jobs. Well, almost all of them. Some are still struggling in precarious appointments. But that same happens to right-wingers. Right-wingers don't have all the jobs they want. Why? Because the majority of professors and lecturers are right-wingers. That makes critical criminologists a niche group of people that are sought after and needed by students to give them a variety of perspectives and not just the bourgeois criminology perspective. So I would challenge us to look at the way we teach students so that we can be better able to reach them rather than abandon them to the right-wingers to be recruited into militarism and policing and corrections in prisons. I'm saying this because some of us actually unconsciously work like we are prison officers in our classrooms, the way we treat students. We look at a student who's struggling with a disability, but we don't give that student any extra time in submitting work. We punish the students if they miss a day or two of the deadline. Some of us refuse to accept the work submitted by students after they completed it. Maybe that is something that we should look at again and aim for penal abolitionism within our own classrooms. Give the students some extra time to complete their work because they're struggling, as we can see with the pandemic. Let's not be the prison officers in our own classrooms. Abolish punishments in our classroom. And just to finish with that, I would say that the European group, as far as I can see from the back catalogs and the special issues of the journal, you haven't really addressed decolonization, which is a term that is now raging through all disciplines, but cannot be ignored by the European group. Maybe a special issue focusing on the decolonization of criminology with authors in Australia, in North America, in Africa, in Europe, already contributing to this paradigm. I would say that's a very good thing to look at, in addition to all the other issues that we are looking at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Biko. That was really excellent that you're able to join us and share your thoughts and contribute. And I think people will be very grateful if you could share that link to your paper that you mentioned earlier on in the chat. That would be great. It's just to say that, you know, I haven't wanted to interrupt people because there's been such fantastic talks happening. So we are going to stay on for a bit longer for the question session. But first of all, I'm going to hand over to Stratos Gagoulas, who is also on the Editorial Collective, for his thoughts about the journal and the issue. Thanks, Stratos.
Thank you, Julia, and all the colleagues for their launch and narrating this webinar. And thank you all, colleagues and comrades, for attending this webinar and continuing the good fight. You just heard parts of important papers from esteemed colleagues and friends that address main questions of our times and dare to take a stand. And this is the important issue I want to comment, to add and highlight, and so to add and highlight the importance of their work and the work of the relaunch of our journal. When modern criminology tends to turn into a discussion of technical character, this unfortunately has direct material consequences for critical scholars of the criminal phenomenon like us, from our inability to make publications to our inability to do primary researches due to the fact that there are no resources, until losing our jobs due to controls and established procedures in our labor market. And I'm talking for our colleagues with flexible and precarious jobs, and not only them. Classes continue to exist in relation to the means of production. Different material interests continue to exist. Conflict continue to exist between them, and consensus is produced only as an ideological mechanism, as an attempt to deceive and seeks to lead to a constructed meaning that is in contrast with the existing material experience reality, so that the former prevails over the latter. This lie must be deconstructed, and it is a very important part of a critical criminologist's toil. This is exactly where our real and final work is included. If people really understood the system in which we live, and our esteemed colleagues in the first issue, I think, succeeded in that, if they become aware of who they are and not who they think they are, then they would not accept the system and claim a radical social change. Within this context, the covert and overt procedures of penalization and depenalization, criminalization and decriminalization, etc., by official and non-official bodies and agencies should be highlighted, imprinted, and critically deconstructed. They should be linked to and with material dimensions and corresponding interests. And this whole process should be communicated to wider publications. So then there is room for an applied critical criminological act as a step to social change. And this is our journey. A critical criminological act as a step to social change. Our own very scientific logos is, don't forget that it's still a discipline and control. And at the same time, there are undisciplined producers like us who are threatened, restricted, excluded, but have the opportunity to produce against the dominant scientific habitus when they dare to take a stand. And this very possibility is the hope. This journal, their work, our work, is the hope. It is the heart that continues to beat. It is the living in a zombie community. And I'm talking about the criminological community in total. It is an unfinished process that should be not limited even by ourselves. So it should be go hand in hand with self-criticism, I agree to Biko with that, reflection and deconstruction of any authority, even if this is our own image in the mirror. Thank you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Stratos. A great way to end the talks. So just checking in with all the speakers that are happy to stay on for another 5-10 minutes. Is that okay? Thank you. That's much appreciated. So we had a couple of questions come in. And then after this, if people want to have a chat with one another, we're going to post a link in the chat for a separate Zoom session, which is sort of more of a social say hello and get together. And of course, we look forward to doing that in person in Turin in September, which will be fantastic. And I'm going to be there too, so I'm looking forward to being in Turin. So we've got other people joining us for the question session. Vicki with Ida and Steve with Joe on his paper. So there's one question that's been answered mainly in the by Biko and Ida in the question Q&A section. And there's also another question in there. But first of all, I think I'm going to go to Yasha's question in the chat. And Yasha, apologies if I don't say this completely correctly, but I'm going to read it out and then hand over to the panel for their thoughts. So Yasha says, I love the EG Journal's title. Resistance to bring about justice can be the main antidote to those unequal power relations which states are using every available crisis to entrench and intensify, and fabricating crises when excuses have run out. From COVID to migration policy and other issues, does it not appear that a habit of exaggerating threats to empower and enhance state powers as part of a power grab has made states unable to address real and serious crises when they rear their ugly heads, as happened with COVID? So who would like to start us off with a response to that?
Mhm.
David?
Right, I'm going to be the first amongst the group to admit that the question is probably too clever for me to answer. Nobody's saying that, but I can tell in everyone's eyes they don't. So I'm going to be brave here, and I do think. Look, I think that obviously what the pandemic revealed is what every crisis reveals, which is the state's strengths and the state's weaknesses, right? And so, you know, one of the examples that I didn't get to from my paper, you know, does indicate this, what the state, how the state constructs its own weakness, right? So that's second stage of the second kind of regime of accumulation that I talked about, the amplification in industrial farming. I mean, we're not specifically, that's not necessarily how this virus emerged. Certainly, it's very unlikely it came from, its origins were in this wet market. I think that's quite a racist, that was always inflected by a kind of racist analysis. I think probably the lab kind of discussion is, you know, as well, but we don't really know, you know, where it came from, but we know where bird flu came from, H5N1, we know where H1N1 swine flu came from, and how it spread, and it spread through something which is a relatively recent phenomenon, these huge, large concentrated animal feeding operations, where you've got, I mean, in the UK, 70% of meat production is in those kind of places, defined as more than 1,000 beef cattle, more than 700 dairy cows, 2,500 pigs. In the States, that's 99% of meat is in that kind of scale of a chicken farm with 125,000 chickens. 99% of chickens are produced at that scale in the States, 70% in the UK, right? So if we want to deal with the possibility of future viruses, we need to deal with that problem. There's absolutely no doubt about it, because it's a miracle that there hasn't been a swine flu or a bird flu which has been as infectious, more infectious and more deadly than the viruses that we experienced, right? And that makes the state look kind of powerless, right? That kind of scale. But then we look at what happened in Denmark, in the Netherlands, and in other European countries in response to COVID, and it wasn't just the furlough and the kind of bailouts and all that. They closed down mink farms. They closed down big, I mean, huge. For Denmark, mink farming is a huge commercial kind of operation, and they did so because the conditions were there, and I think because partly of public pressure. Now, that for me indicates both on one side the kind of the weakness of the state to do anything is a kind of myth, right? Because we also know that in the UK we're talking probably about almost £1 trillion worth, yes, £1 trillion worth of quantitative easing, right? We're talking about something which is on the scale of maybe 3 times the response to the pandemic. I mean, if you think about what that could do in terms of social transformation, that reveals the power of the state as well in the face of those kind of conditions. So, you know, in that sense, I think it is all about how we organize resistance to demand how that level of resources is deployed and what we want out, because there is going to be another crisis, and we better get ready to be arguing for the kinds of things that we want to come out of that crisis. And I think it is an end. You know, if we're talking about a kind of zoonotic spillover, it's an end to deforestation on this scale. It's an end to industrial farming. It's an end to the casualization of workplaces, which means that workers can't resist those kind of conditions. So I think the strengths and the weaknesses of a state indicate how we have to resist.
Brilliant. Thanks, David. Steve, did you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, just very briefly, and I think it kind of follows on a bit from what Dave says, and I too am a bit, you know, not really going to address the question properly. It is a bit tough, but I think it's a relevant observation. So, Stuart Hall, whom Biko mentioned earlier on, Stuart Hall and colleagues in Policing the Crisis, they implied they didn't follow this through, but they implied that to understand who and what gets policed and regulated, we also have to understand who and what doesn't get policed and doesn't get regulated. And so they kind of left a space there for a necessary focus on the crimes of the powerful, including the state, including corporations, which they didn't really follow through, because that's not what they were doing in that book. It was around a particular moment in British policing and the breakdown of British Empire. And I think that kind of takes me back to a point that Joe made or alluded to in his overview of our paper, which he managed to pull off in 8 minutes. Thank you very much, Joe. So in the first year of the crisis in the UK, there were 85,000 fixed penalty notices, fines issued to ordinary men and women and young people around the country. During that same period, not one single employer was prosecuted, not one, despite the fact that we know that workplaces, including workplaces like sites of transportation, as Dave mentioned, were key sites of transmission of the virus. They were left virtually unregulated. Right? HSE, the regulator, effectively withdrew from inspecting during that period. So it's just to say that, you know, and so when we think about state power, indeed partly through law enforcement and then resistance, to kind of reinforce the point Dave made, we need always to maintain a dialectical understanding of how state power works, where state activity is concentrated. Part of that's through law and through law enforcement. So it's just to kind of make sure that we retain that focus, really.
Brilliant, thank you. Joe, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just very quickly, it's a great question, I think, in many respects, a whole lot of different levels. But I think one of the things that's come out in the last 2.5 years is that the state doesn't give a shit, actually, about the social junk, as they see it, about people dying right, left and centre. National states don't care. International states don't care when you look at the levels of deaths in places like Mexico and Peru, etc. So people have been classified and categorized, to use Stephen Spitzer's great work for all those years ago, as social junk. And that social junk, as we saw, particularly with regard to people and older people in homes, have been decimated. So that's the first thing. The violence and the systemic indifference of the capitalist state, which has been there for 200 years, is ongoing. Second thing is that we allude to it in our paper, but couldn't get into it here, but probably certainly in the UK, but elsewhere, the deconstruction of the brittle structures of democratic accountability. We call it a very British coronavirus coup that's going on in our country, right across the board. And I guess that might be happening in other countries as well. I'd love to hear about that. But certainly in this country, what we've got now is what not called a new moving rights show, a great new moving rights show in many respects, picking up on Stuart Hall's work. And you know, that is a huge, you know, I don't like using phrases like fascism or neo-fascism. You know, there's all sorts of problems with that. But I think the new moving rights show that's happening, certainly in the UK, and the complete deconstruction of what a constitution, which was immensely brittle anyway in so many respects, is something which is, you know, happening here. And that great new moving rights show, underpinned by a very British coronavirus coup, is something to take cognizance of, I think, and also generate spirits of resistance as well. I don't think that answers the question, by the way, but it's just something I thought might be interesting. Thanks, Joe. We've got Ida and Vicky. I suggest that you follow up and then we finish off this section, because I can see that some people are saying they have to go, and then you carry on having the discussion in the Zoom chat, if that's okay with you. But do make your point now, Vicky and Ida.
I'll just be very quick. Thanks, Julia. I think we should probably make the next session a bit more social and less formal with less heads. But I think this has been really fantastic. I just want to draw together some of the points that people. So we've changed our name to Vida Kanstad. I'm Vicky. This is Ida, in case anybody doesn't know who either of us were. But Ida had previously also been the coordinator of the European group. One thing I wanted to pick up is that there's this kind of, there's the obvious issue that has impacted in relation to workplaces in terms of transmission of COVID-19, but also the lack of implementation of support for people working remotely as well in relation to mental health, and the way in which everyone was expected to move and be able to understand what was going on around them, become technological wizards, etc. in between, with pressures, with lack of recognition that the impacts of not knowing what was going on around us. There was a point in this pandemic where we all genuinely thought everyone around us was going to be, you know, dying, dead, ill, etc. And that has happened for some of us with no regard for those people that it's happened for. And it has happened for the rest of us with no regard for the impacts of the shock factor and the long-going implications of that. So I think workplaces have a lot to respond to that goes well beyond, you know, yoga at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon or whatever. We really need to think about supporting people as we move beyond what is now effectively a double workload, because we're working online, offline, you know, everything else that we're all doing. And in the context of, for the people in this arena, I'm sure, very difficult environments that already work with very difficult and emotionally laborious issues with people that we care about very deeply, and on issues that we care about deeply, which are not given the traction that is required to be able to help us to do this job well, or to do all of our jobs well. Which brings me into something that Biko said, you know, about talking about not, you know, about not policing our students. And I think this is a really good idea, except for many institutions in the neoliberal university, to even not police has been taken out of our hands, because it's been outsourced into other people to police on our behalfs that we aren't even involved in. And I'm quite sure that that is probably because many lecturers, you know, temporary or permanent, etc., will have been complaining, but this has happened to this student, that has happened to this. What can we, you know, how do we support? And so even to not police has often been taken out of our own hands, because we would be policing for the well-being of people in a much more feasible and reasonable structural sense, well beyond trying to be punitive. And I think that really made me think as well, because maybe until now I had never considered that it has been deliberately taken away, because we were policing, trying not to police for those amongst us who are critical and not wanting to be punitive toward students that we are working with every day. And then the last two things also kind of coming from what Biko said, calls for papers for this journal were internationalized. The European group is a collaborative, it is internationalized and should be more so. So let's work together to make sure any of these calls are much further, as much as we can make it and as far as we can make it. I also love Stratos, you're the beating heart thing. Of course, that's why we invited to make sure that we had this language to bring us back to the human. Calls for papers, yeah, internationalized. Decolonization, Biko, I completely agree, but going forward with this journal, I think we have to be very conscious of the colonization of decolonization, and I'm not sure if I can bear to be part of many more boards where it is exclusively white people decolonizing the curriculum. So if it goes forward with decolonization, it has to do so without without being colonized. So completely agree, let's do that. But with that as a central aspect. And I think it's very great to think about the decolonization of criminology. I would still say, and I know that there are discussions in the European group around this in relation to critical criminology, but as far as the history and language of criminalization is focused on those who are most powerless, I would still advocate the abolition of criminology toward a move towards emiology. And I just wonder how much that can ever be decolonized. But I think all of this has brought together so many fantastic points and so many things to think about, and a really exciting time for this journal to be moving forward with these as it is. Brilliant. And thanks so much also to Policy Press and to Julia and Angela for putting everything together, because really without all of that work behind the scenes, it wouldn't have been done. So massive, massive thanks for everything over the last 3 or 4 years as well.
Thank you, Vicky. Yeah, and I was going to say a huge personal thanks to you for all the work you did in helping, the whole collaboration move into Policy Press and the transition and everything else, and being consultant editor, and also to, especially to John, Ida and Lisa, journal editors. If John is here, he just had a new baby. Congratulations, John. And you've all been absolutely amazing. And I know that, being a journal editor is difficult in these times, when you've already got massive workloads. So we massively appreciate everything that you're doing. And I'm going to finish up now. Thank you very much to all the speakers. Thank you very much to all of you for participating. Join the Zoom, have a social chat, and hopefully we'll see a lot of you in Turin. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.